They called her Hollow long before she understood what the word was supposed to cost her. At first, Maren thought it was just a description, the way people said a well was dry or a barn was empty. She thought hollow meant nothing much, a shape with no use for it, a thing you noted in passing and then forgot. She learned better at 13, on the night the village elder pressed a carved bone token to the center of her palm and waited, the way every elder in Wintermere had waited over every child come of age for 300 years, for the token to warm. The whole village had gathered in the longhouse because every child of Wintermere was tested at 13 for the frost gift, the old bond that let certain families track game through blind snow, calm a starving wolf pack with a raised hand, read a coming blizzard in the color of the sky a full day before it broke. Wintermere did not survive its winters on grain alone. It survived on the handful of gifted hunters and trackers each generation produced, and every family prayed, every single year, that this would be the year their child was one of them. The bone token in Maren's palm stayed cold. "Nothing," the elder said, and drew her hand back as though she had touched frost that bit. The word moved through the longhouse the way cold moves through a cracked door. No gift, no bond, no warmth in the blood the old ways could measure. Nothing. Her mother wept quietly into her sleeve. Her father did not weep at all. He only looked at Maren once, with an expression flatter than disappointment, and by the following week, she had been moved out of the family loft and into the narrow room above the kennels, where the hunting dogs were kept, and where a girl with no gift for tracking could at least be useful, mucking out their runs. By the second winter, the other children had stopped inviting her to the fire circle. By the third, grown villagers had started calling her hollow to her face, the way you'd name a broken tool before you threw it out, because Wintermere was a practical place, and a practical place had little patience for a mouth that ate through winter and gave nothing back to the hunt. So Maren grew up the way overlooked things grow, in the cold margins, on short rations, with a stubborn talent for making herself small enough not to be noticed and useful enough not to be sent away entirely. By 18, she worked the kennels full time, feeding and mucking and mending the harness leather the real hunters wore out chasing game the old bond let them find. She slept above the dogs because the dogs, at least, never called her anything at all. And every night that winter, after the longhouse fires banked low and the forest beyond Wintermere's palisade became one unbroken wall of black, Maren carried half her own bread ration out past the kennel gate to the woodshed where she kept the fox. She had found it 3 weeks into the season's first hard freeze, curled in the lee of a fallen log, with one hind leg bent wrong and its small ribs showing through matted fur, too weak even to flinch when her lantern light fell across it. Wintermere trapped foxes for their pelts every season without a second thought. A half-dead kid in a snowbank was, by every practical measure the village believed in, already spoken for by the weather. Maren had knelt in the snow anyway, and looked into eyes too dark to read, and felt something in her chest pull tight the way it never did for anything the village asked of her. "I know," she whispered, not sure why the words came at all. I know what it's like to be the thing nobody thought worth the trouble. She should have left it. Wintermere believed, the way it believed most things, that nature finished what weakness began, and that sentiment over a dying animal was a luxury for people who did not need every scrap of food themselves. She carried it to the woodshed instead, wrapped in the corner of her own shawl, and laid it in a nest of dry straw where the kennel's banked cook fire kept just enough warmth bleeding through the wall to matter. She stole nothing that first night. She simply sat with it until her own shivering matched its own, and told herself that was not the same as care. By the second night, she was lying. She brought broth cooled from the dog's own pot, dripped from a cracked ladle into the fox's mouth a few drops at a time. She brought bread softened in melted snow. She brought, on the nights she had nothing else to give, only her own hands cupped around its narrow chest, because Corwin the kennel master had once told her that a body too cold to warm itself sometimes only needed another body's patience pressed close enough to remind it how. The fox did not die. Its leg healed, crooked but sound. Its ribs filled in slowly under a coat that thickened as the weeks passed, until by midwinter it was less a dying thing and more a small, sharp-eyed shadow that pressed its cold nose into her palm the moment she opened the shed door. Every single night, without fail. "You're going to get me in trouble," she told it once, voice pitched low enough that even the dogs on the other side of the wall wouldn't stir. "You're the reason I'll be accused of witching game away from the hunters if anyone finds you." The fox blinked at her, entirely unbothered. She laughed despite herself, a small, rusty sound she hardly recognized as her own. "So, I suppose that makes us well matched." Corwin the kennel master noticed, of course, the way old men who spend their lives around animals always notice more than they say. He caught her once, near midwinter, slipping out past the kennel gate with a bundle under her shawl, and instead of reporting her, he only asked, in his gruff, unhurried way, whether the thing she was keeping alive back there needed a warmer bed than a woodshed floor could give it. She had frozen, certain this was the end of the only good thing she had left. But Corwin had simply grunted, handed her a worn horse blanket from the tack room, and told her that a good hand with a hurt animal was worth more than any bone token, whatever the elders liked to believe, and that he'd trained enough hunters in his life to know the difference between a gift that announced itself loudly and one that simply showed up, night after night, and did the work nobody else was willing to do. It was the first kind thing anyone in Wintermere had said to her in 5 years, and she carried it back to the woodshed that night, warmer than the blanket itself. The fox grew bolder as the weeks passed. It began waiting for her at the shed door rather than cowering in its nest of straw. Would climb, awkward on its healing leg, halfway up her arm before she'd even settled onto the floor beside it. She found herself talking to it the way she no longer let herself talk to any person in the village, about her mother's face the night of the testing, about the particular ache of being fed last at every meal, about the strange, persistent hope she couldn't quite kill, no matter how many winters Wintermere spent trying. "You're a terrible secret to keep," she told it one night, running a thumb along the ridge of its spine. "If anyone ever traced the missing bread back here, I don't think even Corwin's kindness would save either of us." The fox only pressed closer, indifferent to the danger it represented, and Maren understood, some nights, that she needed it to survive the winter every bit as much as it needed her. It was the closest thing to companionship she had known in 5 years. Nobody in Wintermere waited for Maren's footstep. Nobody brightened when she entered a room, because she was rarely permitted to enter the rooms that mattered at all. But the fox did, every night, without needing to be told what she was worth. For a girl who had spent most of her life being counted as a mouth and nothing more, that alone felt like something dangerous to want. The night everything changed began, as most disasters in Maren's life did, with someone else's suspicion. Mistress Odile Crane ran Wintermere's stores the way a general runs a siege, every measure accounted for, every scrap defended against theft, with a discipline that had outlasted 3 reeves and 2 hard famines. She caught Maren slipping a heel of bread and a strip of dried rabbit into her apron after the evening meal, and her mouth thinned in the particular way that meant a punishment was already decided before the question was even asked. "For the dogs?" Odile said. "Yes, mistress. The dogs are fed from the kennel stores, not the longhouse pantry." The room had gone quiet around them. 2 kitchen girls found sudden urgent business with the washing. Odile reached into Maren's apron herself and drew out the bread, the rabbit, and a small twist of dried herbs Maren had been saving for the fox's still-healing leg. Not enough to feed a starving village. Far too much for a girl with no gift and no standing to explain away. "You steal now," Odile said. "I meant to pay it back." "With what wage? What gift? What claim do you have on anything in this village that you could ever pay back?" Maren had no answer, because Wintermere had spent 5 years teaching her there wasn't one. By nightfall, Reeve Talbot Ferris had decided her punishment himself, delighted, as he always was, by any chance to remind the hollow girl exactly how little standing she held. She would spend the worst night of that winter's worst storm outside the palisade wall, chained to the old trapper's post, where poachers were once left to face the cold and think on their crimes, because Talbot said honest fear cured more thieving hearts than any lecture ever had. Nobody argued. Nobody in Wintermere argued for a girl the testing had already declared hollow. They chained her wrists to the iron ring at dusk, as the season's worst blizzard began gathering itself over the tree line, and left her a single guttering lantern that would not, everyone privately understood, last the night. Maren had never been more afraid in her life, and even through that fear, her first coherent thought was for the fox, alone in the woodshed, waiting for a visit that would not come. The storm broke within the hour. Snow came sideways, hard enough to sting through wool, and the temperature dropped fast enough that Maren felt her own thoughts start to slow and blur at the edges. The particular creeping calm that old trappers always warned meant the cold was winning. She thought distantly that this was probably how it ended for hollow girls in villages like Wintermere, not a dramatic death. Just an oversight, allowed to run its course. Then, through the white roar of the storm, she heard something that was not wind. A shape moved at the tree line, low and fast, and for one confused moment, Maren thought her own fox had somehow followed her scent through the blizzard. But the shape that resolved out of the snow was too large, too deliberate, moving upright on two legs, with a stillness the storm itself seemed to part around rather than touch. A man in black, walking directly into the heart of the worst storm Wintermere had seen in a decade, at an hour so close to dawn that the eastern sky already carried the first gray warning of first light. Every hunter in Wintermere knew what that meant. No creature of the old blood traveled this near sunrise unless something had gone badly wrong. He crossed the last distance to the trapper's post in a handful of strides and knelt before her without a word. And up close, even through her fading vision, Maren understood she was looking at something the storm itself deferred to. His skin held the pale, unbroken stillness of something that had not aged in centuries. His eyes, when they found hers, were a deep, banked red, like coals seen through smoke. "You smell of fox blood and breadcrumbs," he said, and his voice was low and even and entirely wrong for the storm shrieking around them. And something older beneath both. Maren's teeth were chattering too hard to answer. He broke the iron chain at her wrists with one closed fist, the metal parting with no more effort than snapping a dry twig, and lifted her against his chest as though her weight were an afterthought. "Hold on," he said. "The sun is coming, and I would rather not explain to my own household why their Lord let the dawn catch him standing outside a human village for a girl he has not yet properly met." She did not remember much of the walk after that. Only warmth, impossible and steady, pressed against a body that carried no heartbeat she could find, and the last clear thought she had before the cold finally took her under was that whatever this man was, he had come for her specifically, at an hour that should have kept even his kind safely behind stone. She woke in a bed too soft to be real, beneath a ceiling too high to belong to any building in Wintermere. A fire burned low in a hearth larger than the whole kennel loft she'd slept in for 5 years. Furs, not rough wool, covered her to the chin, and curled against her side, small and warm and utterly unbothered by the change in scenery, lay the fox, heeled leg tucked neat beneath its body, dark eyes watching her wake with the same patient attention it had always given her. "You're both remarkably difficult to keep track of," said a voice from the doorway. The man from the storm stood there now in ordinary candlelight rather than snow and half-dark, and Maren understood, seeing him clearly for the first time, exactly how much danger she had been carried into. He was tall, in a way that made the doorway look built for someone smaller. His hair fell black past his shoulders. His face held the terrible, symmetrical stillness of something too perfect to have ever been merely human, softened only slightly by the faint, careful concern in his expression as he watched her stir. "Where am I?" Her voice came out cracked and thin. Thornkeep. He came no closer than the foot of the bed, waiting, she realized, for some sign that she wanted him nearer before he risked it. My household, you are safe here. She pushed herself upright against the pillows, wincing at the deep ache still settled in her bones, and studied him with the wary attention of someone used to danger arriving disguised as kindness. Why did you come yourself? A lord doesn't walk into a killing storm for a scout he could have sent a dozen riders to fetch. No, Dorian agreed. He doesn't. But 11 years is a long time to trust a single creature to carry your voice across a dangerous valley. And when 3 days passed with no word at all, sending riders felt like an insult to what he'd earned from me. I went myself because I didn't trust anyone else to look hard enough. And you found me instead. I found the reason he'd stopped answering my call at all. Dorian's gaze did not waver from hers. He was healed, fed, warmer than he had any right to be in a kennel loft that clearly could not spare the food. He did not want to leave you, and once I understood why, neither did I. And the fox, something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, belongs to me, has for 11 years. He is one of my blood-bound scouts, sent south this autumn to carry word along the border villages, and he did not return when expected. I searched the length of the valley for him before his trail finally led me to a woodshed behind a kennel, and to a girl who had apparently decided a half-dead fox deserved better than the weather Wintermere was willing to give it. Maren's throat tightened. You came looking for him. I came looking for him. His gaze held hers, red and steady and entirely unhurried. I did not expect to find someone worth the same searching. She should have been afraid. Every story Wintermere told around its fires about the old blood, night riders who emptied villages that displeased them, lords in mountain keeps who traded in blood and bargains, beautiful and merciless things that wore human shape the way a wolf might wear sheep's wool, unspooled behind her eyes in that moment. And none of it matched the man standing patiently at the foot of her bed, plainly waiting on her comfort before his own curiosity. What's your name? She asked, because it seemed absurdly like the safest question available to her. Dorian Varek. He inclined his head, an old and formal gesture that looked strange, paired with the plain black wool he wore. Lord of Thornkeep, and, I am told by my own physician, though I have yet to fully credit it, the reason your blood has been waiting 18 years to be noticed by someone who knew what he was looking at. Maren stared at him. That doesn't make sense. No, Dorian agreed. It rarely does. The first time someone tells you that everything you were taught about yourself was wrong. Word of what had happened at the trapper's post reached Wintermere's longhouse before the storm had even fully cleared, carried by a shepherd who'd seen the Lord of Thornkeep himself walking into the blizzard on foot, at an hour no creature of the old blood should have risked exposure. For a hollow kennel girl, nobody in the village had thought worth a second glance in 5 years. Reeve Talbot Ferris did not believe it until Dorian's riders arrived at the palisade gate 3 days later, black cloaks stark against the snow, and the Reeve understood, watching them dismount with the unhurried confidence of men who had never once needed to hurry, that whatever had happened out at that post was about to become very much his problem. Dorian did not raise his voice when he addressed the gathered village. He never needed to. "I would like the records," he said, "concerning the girl you tested at 13 and declared hollow." Father Silas Combe, pale and clutching the same bone token that had once lain cold in Maren's palm, produced the old ledger with hands that shook. Dorian read it in silence, red eyes moving down the page at a speed no human scholar could have matched. And Maren, standing wrapped in a borrowed fur cloak at his side, watched something in his stillness sharpen into something far more dangerous than his earlier calm. "You recorded her as gifted with nothing," he said at last, "and on the strength of that single measurement, stripped her of family claim, denied her inheritance, and bound her to labor for food for 5 years. "The testing is old law," Talbot said, finding a scrap of his usual bluster. "We follow the old law here." "Your old law tested for the frost bond," Dorian said. "A gift that answers loudly, all at once, the moment a bone token meets warm blood. It was never built to notice a gift that only answers slowly, through patience, through months of a starving thing being kept alive by someone too stubborn to let it die. You did not test her for nothing, Reeve. You tested her wrong, and then punished her for 5 years, because your own instrument was too blunt to read what she actually carried." The Longhouse had gone utterly silent. "She carries night blood," Dorian went on, and the words moved through the gathered village the way frost moves through a cracked pane. "Old blood, thinned by generations, sealed so deep by grief and neglect that no coming-of-age test built for louder gifts could ever have found it. My own physician confirmed it within an hour of her arrival at Thornkeep. It is, by his account, exceedingly rare. Rarer, certainly, than anything your frost bond has produced in 3 centuries of testing." Mistress Odile Crane's face had gone the color of old snow. "That cannot be. She stole from my stores. She lied about. She fed a starving creature with food she could not spare," Dorian said. "The same food your own ledgers show she was allotted at less than half a hunter's ration, despite doing a hunter's share of labor in your kennels. She kept him warm through a season your own trappers would have let him die in without a second thought. And you chained her outside your palisade wall in a killing storm because she asked to pay back a debt she had no wage to pay." No one in the Longhouse had ever heard their own cruelty described so plainly by someone with the power to make them answer for it. Talbot tried once more, because men who have built their authority on other people's smallness rarely surrender it gracefully. "She belongs to this village by birth. Whatever gift she carries doesn't change that." Dorian's gaze moved to the ledger's final entry, the one recording Maren's status revised at 13. No inheritance, no family claim, no village protection beyond the barest subsistence labor could earn her. And then back to the Reeve, and something in his expression made even the gathered hunters take an involuntary step back. "By your own record," he said, "this village released every claim it had on her the day it declared her hollow. You cannot spend 5 years treating a person as a burden with no rights worth honoring, and then invoke ownership the moment that same person becomes valuable to someone else. That is not law. That is convenience wearing law's clothing." He turned to Maren, and his voice gentled in a way it had not once, in the whole confrontation, for anyone else in that room. "Do you wish to stay here?" The question landed somewhere old and aching in her chest. Did she belong to the loft above the kennels? To a village that had counted her worth in scraps for 5 winters? To a testing that had declared her nothing, and a mistress who had chained her to a post in a killing storm over half a loaf of bread? "No," she said, and the word came out steadier than she expected. Dorian nodded once, as though he had known the answer before he'd asked it. "Then she does not belong to Wintermere. She belongs, from this hour, under the protection of Thornkeep, by the old accords, and by blood now properly recognized." Nobody in that longhouse argued with him again. The weeks that followed felt, to Maren, like learning to breathe in air that had never once tried to starve her. Thornkeep's household absorbed her the way a hearth absorbs a cold hand, carefully at first, then completely. The keep's steward, a silver-haired woman named Mira, who governed the household with brisk and unshowy competence, had Maren's chambers stocked with warm clothes and hot water before she'd even finished her first full meal at the long table, and answered every one of Maren's uncertain questions about her own place there with the same unbothered certainty. "You are under his protection. That is all anyone here needs to know." Dorian's physician, a quiet, thorough man named Bellamy, examined her twice in that first month, each time with Dorian himself present, standing near enough to worry and far enough to respect the boundary of it. "The bloodline runs thin, but it runs true," Bellamy told them both, one candlelit evening, after pressing 2 fingers to the point beneath her collarbone, where a strange, steady warmth had lived ever since the night at the trapper's post. Old night blood, crossed with human stock some 6 or 7 generations back, likely during the border peace your grandfather's grandfather signed, my lord. It explains the affinity for wounded things. It explains why the fox trusted her on sight, and why your own instincts carried you through a blizzard toward a girl you had never met. "And the testing that found nothing?" Maren asked, voice smaller than she intended. Bellamy's expression turned careful in the particular way of a man about to say something true and unkind about people who were not in the room to defend themselves. "A gift like yours does not announce itself to a bone token the way a frost bond does. It answers to patience, to care given without expectation of return. 5 years of being told you carried nothing would have taught most people to stop giving that kind of care altogether, out of simple self-protection. You did not stop. That is, I suspect, the rarer gift by far." "Will it grow stronger?" Maren asked. "Or is this, whatever this is, as much as I'll ever carry?" Bellamy considered the question with the same unhurried care he gave every question, turning it over as though it deserved better than a quick answer. "Bonds like yours tend to deepen with use, much like a muscle. The more you extend that patience toward creatures, toward people, toward my Lord himself, the more the old blood seems to answer. I would not be surprised if, a year from now, You find yourself capable of things neither of us can presently predict. Or you may simply remain exactly as you are, quietly extraordinary in a way most of the world never bothers to notice. Either outcome, if I may say so, strikes me as a considerable improvement over Hollow. Something in Maren's chest loosened, hearing that, in a way, 5 years of Wintermere's verdicts never had. Dorian, across the room, said nothing at all, but she caught the look on his face before he smoothed it away. The same quiet fury she'd seen in him the night he'd read her village's ledger aloud, banked now into something steadier, something that looked, if she let herself believe it, almost like tenderness standing guard. That night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion still pulling at her limbs, Maren dreamed of a long stone corridor lined with doors she did not recognize. Behind each one stood a different version of herself, the girl with the cold bone token in her palm, the girl sleeping above the kennel dogs, the girl chained to the trapper's post with her lips going blue. She walked past every door without opening one, because she already knew what waited behind each, and at the corridor's end stood a final door, unmarked, warm light spilling from beneath it. When she opened it, Dorian stood on the other side, waiting, saying nothing, simply holding out one hand the way he had in the storm. This time, in the dream, she did not hesitate before taking it. She woke with a gasp that brought him to her doorway within seconds, hair loose, expression sharp with alarm. "You called for me," he said, though she hadn't spoken a word aloud that she remembered. "I don't think I did. Not with my voice." He went very still. "The bond, then. It wakes when you do, sometimes, if the feeling behind it runs strong enough." He crossed the room, but stopped a respectful distance from the bed, waiting, as he always did, for some sign she wanted him nearer, before he risked closing that last space between them. "What did you dream?" she told him, haltingly, about the corridor of doors, about walking past every old version of herself without stopping, about the last door and the light beneath it, and his hand waiting on the other side. Something moved behind his eyes, quick and unguarded before he caught it. "And did you take it? In the dream?" "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. "Good," he said, finally, very simply, and the words settled into her chest with more weight than any grander declaration could have carried. Word of what had happened at Wintermere did not stay contained to Wintermere for long. By the second month, distorted versions of the story had traveled the valley roads in both directions. That the Hollow Girl had bewitched the Lord of Thornkeep with old forest magic. That she'd stolen a blood-bound creature to buy her way into his favor. That no ordinary village girl simply woke up with night blood, unless something darker than luck had arranged it. Talbot Ferris, stung by his own public humiliation, did little to correct the uglier versions, and Maren understood, reading the reports Mira brought her with careful, unhappy patience, that her old Reeve had chosen exactly the kind of small, petty revenge available to a man with no other power left to wield. It was in the middle of that quiet, corrosive stretch of weeks that Maren finally asked Dorian the question she had been circling since the night at the trapper's post. She found him in the western gallery one evening, staring out at the last gray light over the mountains, the way he often did when something weighed on him he had not yet decided to name. She stood beside him a long while before she spoke. "What am I to you?" she asked. "Truly. Not the physician's language, not the household's careful courtesy. I want the plain answer." Dorian did not look away from the mountains at first. When he finally turned to her, something in his expression had gone unusually unguarded. "To my blood," he said slowly, "you are recognition, the oldest and simplest thing my kind knows how to feel toward another. To my household, you are under my protection, which is not a small thing here, though I understand it may sound like one to you. To me," he stopped, and for the first time since she had known him, he seemed to be searching for words rather than choosing them with his usual, unhurried precision. "To me," he said at last, "you are the first thing in longer than I can comfortably measure that has felt inevitable. Not chosen, not decided upon. Simply inevitable, the way winter is inevitable, or the way a fox trusts the one hand that was patient with it. I did not go looking for that in a kennel girl from a village I had no particular reason to visit. I found it anyway." Her breath caught somewhere high in her chest. "And if I tell you, I don't know what to do with that yet?" "Then I wait," he said simply. "I have had a great deal of practice at waiting for things worth having. No grand declaration, no ancient claim laid across her like a burden. Just those 3 words, offered without demand, and Maren felt something in her chest unclench that had been wound tight since the night the bone token stayed cold in her palm. It was on a night not long after that, with the fire burned low and Mira's household finally gone quiet around them, that Dorian kissed her for the first time. Slowly, carefully, his hand rising to her face and pausing there, just long enough to let her refuse if she wanted to. She did not. The kiss tasted faintly of the mulled wine Mira insisted on serving every evening past midwinter, and beneath it, something colder and stranger that Maren was beginning to understand simply meant him. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his chest and listened for a heartbeat she already knew she would not find. There was no absence there either, only him, steady and certain, the impossible fact that something cold to the touch could somehow still feel like the warmest room she had ever stood in. There was a crueler rumor, too, one Mira hesitated to bring her at all, that Maren's parents had known all along what she carried, and had cast her out of the family loft, not from shame at her failed testing, but from fear of what a night-blood child might someday become, and had simply let the village's cruder verdict of hollow stand, because it was easier to explain than the truth. Maren did not know whether to believe it. She thought of her mother's tears the night of the testing, and her father's flat, final silence, and understood that she might never have a clean answer to which cruelty had actually shaped her childhood. Neglect born of shame, or neglect born of fear. Some questions, she was learning, simply did not resolve themselves the way stories like to promise they would. Dorian read the same reports in silence, and then folded them once, and said only, "We will go back. You don't need to defend my name to people who already decided who I was before I could speak for myself," Maren said. No, he agreed. But I find I am no longer willing to let cruel men have the last word about someone I intend to keep. They rode into Wintermere at midday, under banners the village had never seen before. Dark cloth marked with Thornkeep's old sigil, carried by riders whose silent discipline alone was enough to still every tongue in the square. Maren stepped down from the carriage in deep blue wool, with color back in her face, and the fox curled warm and healed around her shoulders. And the village that had once called her hollow watched her walk toward the longhouse steps with an expression she had never once been permitted to wear inside its walls. Visibility. Talbot tried, one final time, to salvage some scrap of authority. My lord, if this concerns the rumors, I assure you the village has made no formal accusation. This is not about rumor, Dorian said. This is about truth, spoken once, plainly, so no one in this valley can claim afterward they never heard it. He turned to the gathered crowd rather than the reeve, and Maren felt, standing beside him, the old instinct to shrink rise up in her one last time, before something steadier answered it instead. Tell them, Dorian said quietly, not a command, an invitation. Maren looked out over the faces she had grown up beneath, some ashamed already, some still hardened, most simply uncertain what to do with a girl who no longer needed anything from them. I belonged here, she said, and her voice carried further across that square than she had ever once believed it could. When I mucked your kennels for less than half a ration. When I froze outside your gate for feeding a dying creature you would have let die without a second thought. When I was useful and quiet and asked for nothing, I belonged here perfectly well. The square had gone utterly still. But the moment I needed kindness instead of usefulness, this village had none to spare me. So no, I don't belong to Wintermere. I never really did. You only ever let me stay because I cost you almost nothing to keep. Some faces in that crowd hardened further, but some, more than she'd once believed possible of the village that raised her, looked down at their own boots in open shame, and for Maren, watching it happen, that was enough of a reckoning to carry home. Talbot made one final attempt at authority, his voice pitched for the crowd rather than for her. The village fed you for 5 years, sheltered you. Whatever debt you imagine we owe you, surely it runs both directions. Maren turned to him, and for the first time in her life, she did not lower her eyes before a man who outranked her. You fed me a hunter's leavings and called it generosity. You sheltered me above your dogs and called it family. If that's the debt you think I owe, I've already paid it 5 times over in kennel work you never once thanked me for. We're even, Reeve Ferris. More than even. A ripple of something moved through the crowd at that. Not quite approval, but recognition. The particular stillness of people watching an old, comfortable lie finally get named out loud in daylight, where no one could pretend not to have heard it. They did not stay to watch the shame settle into anything more permanent. Dorian offered his hand, and Maren took it in front of the whole gathered village, and they rode back toward Thornkeep before the winter light had even begun to fail. Spring came slowly to the valley that year, the way it always did, but it came. Wintermere sent tribute to Thornkeep that season, not out of any sudden change of heart, but out of the plainer, more honest fear that comes from finally understanding exactly how much power you spent 5 years insulting. Dorian accepted it without comment and redirected half of it, quietly, to the village's own kennel workers and unclaimed children, the ones the frost testing had judged hollow, and the village had judged disposable, the way it had once judged her. Corwin, the kennel master, sent word that spring, too, a short, gruff note carried by a passing trader, saying only that he'd trained 3 new hunters over the winter, and none of them had a fraction of the patience she'd once shown a half-dead kit in a snowbank, and that Wintermere's kennels had been poorer company since she left, whatever anyone else in the village cared to admit aloud. Maren read the note 3 times, and kept it folded in the same pocket where she'd once carried a smooth stone for reassurance, because some kindnesses, however late or small, still deserved to be kept close. Maren returned to Wintermere only once more that year, on a bright, thawing morning when the roads had cleared and the old palisade gate stood open in the ordinary way of a village going about ordinary business. She walked through the square in daylight, unremarkable wool, no fox on her shoulders this time, no riders at her back. Not for vengeance. She had already said what needed saying, for closure. Mistress Odile Crane, older and quieter than Maren remembered, found her near the kennels and tried, haltingly, to apologize. Maren listened to all of it, and then let go of just enough of the old grief to stop carrying it forward, which was not quite forgiveness and not quite absolution, only the plainer relief of setting something heavy down at last. She stopped once more at the kennel gate before she left the village for good, and found the loft above the dog runs exactly as she'd left it. Narrow, cold, smelling faintly of straw and old leather. She had thought, walking up the ladder one last time, that the sight of it might undo her. Instead, she found only a small, quiet gratitude that the girl who had slept there for 5 winters had survived long enough to walk back out again on her own 2 feet, unafraid, wanted somewhere else entirely. That evening, back at Thornkeep, she stood on the high western balcony and watched the sun finish its long descent behind the mountains, the fox dozing warm against her ankles, the keep's ordinary evening sounds drifting up from below. Mira's brisk voice managing some minor household dispute, Bellamy arguing cheerfully with a ledger he was clearly losing to, the low murmur of a household that had made room for her without once asking her to earn it. Dorian came to stand behind her, quiet enough that she felt his presence before she heard it, the way she always did now. Some old, patient warmth beneath her collarbone, recognizing him before her eyes ever confirmed it. His arms came around her, and she let herself lean back into him, not because 5 years of Wintermere's winters had left her too tired to stand on her own, but because she had learned, slowly, that trust could be chosen as deliberately as fear once had been forced on her. "The council wants to know if you'll sit in on next week's border hearing," he murmured against her hair. "Will there be old men explaining bloodlines to me as though I hadn't lived one?" she asked. "Almost certainly." "Then I should probably be there." His quiet laugh moved through her like warmth, finding a room that had been cold too long, she thought, watching the last light fail over the mountains, of the girl she had been, 13 years old, with a cold bone token in her palm, 18 years old, chained to a post in a killing storm. A girl who had spent 5 winters believing that hollow was simply the shape she'd been born to hold. She wished she could go back and tell that girl one true thing. Not that rescue was coming. Not that a lord would someday walk into a blizzard for her. Not even that the village had been wrong about everything, though it had. Something simpler. You were never hollow. You were only waiting for someone patient enough to notice what you'd been carrying all along. Beneath her collarbone, the old sealed blood answered with a warm, steady pulse, the same one that had first stirred to life the night she chose, against every lesson Wintermere had ever taught her, to keep a half-frozen fox alive instead of walking past it. And for the first time in her life, Maren understood that being chosen had never meant suddenly becoming worth something. She had always been worth it. The only thing that had ever changed was that someone with the power to say so out loud had finally done it. If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Like this video, if Maren's journey found something in you. Subscribe and turn on the bell for more dark romance tales about the overlooked ones the world calls hollow, right up until someone finally sees what they were carrying all along. And tell me in the comments, what part of Maren's story stayed with you the longest? Until next time, may the winter keep only what deserves to be kept warm.